Hey folks, welcome to Bootstrap's grid video. So, up to now, you may have been only able to get things to lay out vertically on your page, and that's also going to be a pain point for students up until they learn about Bootstrap's grid system. And listen, don't sweat it, that's fine for the time being, but what we want to do is create more of these complex layouts that are in the challenges folder. And to do so, we're going to need to leverage Bootstrap's grid system, which, lucky for us, is not just pretty robust, but also user-friendly, and it's going to help us achieve these complex layouts. So let's do it. We're going to head back to Bootstrap, and like I mentioned in the previous video, we're going to live mostly in the docs section. This time, though, we're going to scroll down, click on Layouts, and get to the grid page. So the Bootstrap grid system has a couple of pieces that are already pre-built out. Now, we can just copy it, bring it back to our code file, and get this layout. But what we want to do is understand these pre-built classes, so that way we can use the grid system to create more complex layouts. And one of the things that we spend time thinking about is this container piece at the very top. And if you scroll down and look at other examples, it's almost in every single one of them at the top. The documentation does explain it a little bit, but what we found is a pretty cool interactive widget that's more interesting to check out and is actually a little bit more powerful when it comes to explaining what containers do. So you'll find the link for this widget in the Bootstrap grid lesson. And what we got here is a paragraph that currently right now exists without a container. And if you wrap it in a container, this is what it looks like. You'll notice that there's a lot more spacing now from the right and left side. And it is responsive. So the way containers are built is that there's going to be a lot of space on the sides when your page is big enough. However, when your page starts to shrink, let's do it. There's going to be less and less space on the sides because the smaller your display is, the less critical it is to get distance from the walls, and the more important it is to use every inch of real estate there is to try to morph your content to fit your screen size. So let's bring this piece back to our code file and add a container class. All right, heading back to our grid template. And let's say we wanted all the content inside the body, maybe with the exception of the header, to be wrapped inside a container. How would we do that? Well, right after the H1, we're going to create a div, and we're going to give it a class of container. And then we're going to do the closing div all the way at the end of December, because we want to house all 12 months inside that div. All right. And just for the sake of formatting, we're going to highlight all the content inside the class container and just make sure they're nested by indenting. And let's check out the before and after. So this is the before. And when we refresh the page, this is the after. You can see that all 12 divs are now spaced away from the wall, and the main purpose of the container is to house our grid and give us some of this horizontal margin. You'll also notice that we intentionally added a border to the container class, and I'll just take a minute to show you that in the style sheet. And this is to help you and students better visualize the dimensions of the container. Now that we have all 12 div elements inside our container class, it's time to use rows to create these horizontal groups of columns. So let's do it. In this particular example, we see that there are two separate rows. That's not really what we're going to create, because if we're looking at all the different challenges, we don't see any spacing between any of the rows, which tells us that all the 12 months are housed inside the same row class. So let's do that. We're going to go back into the index, and since the container is going to house the entire grid system, our row is going to come right after our container. So div class equals row, and then we're going to close our div right before the closing container div, and the last thing we want to do is just make sure that the 12 months are nested inside our row class by highlighting and indenting. So let's check out the before and after. So this right now, all 12 months are housed inside a container. We added them now, put them all inside a row. Let's refresh the page. And we have visual confirmation. The orange border, if you go to the style sheet, was added to the row class. And we see now that all 12 months are part of the same row. Now, the last piece of the puzzle that's the most fun to play with is columns. Columns are what's going to allow us to create these complex designs where, depending on the column size that we assign to each one of these 12 divs, we're going to make them take up a different amount of space inside the row. So let's tackle this piece, and we're going to recreate challenge 1 first. Let's head back to the documentation to learn a little bit more about columns. Now, columns tend to operate a little bit like cells in a grid. There's one particular part of the documentation that I want to scroll down to highlight something very important about columns, and it is right around here. Now, the column class is used to indicate the number of columns you'd like to use out of the possible 12 per row. Now, that is a really big key point here, is that there are 12 template columns available per row. In this particular code snippet, we have 2 separate rows, one at the top and one at the bottom. The columns inside the top row are not numbered, while the ones in the bottom are. If you want to put together a grid where all the columns are going to take up the same space on any size device, then you can just use the column class without indicating a size. However, if you want a particularly sized column, like these 2 over here, then we'll need to specify a numbered column class. For the challenges that we have to recreate, we will need to specify the column class since we want our columns to take up a certain amount of space inside our row. For challenge number 1, we want 4 equal width columns all the way across. So we can use col-3 to make that happen. Where am I getting col-3 from? Well, remember, we can fit 12 units from one side of the row all the way to the other side of the row. So 12 divided by 4 is 3. So let's head back to our HTML file. And what we need to do now is add col-3 to each one of these 12 months. We can add columns to existing elements, or we can wrap the whole thing inside a column. We're going to go with the former one because it's going to be less effort and makes a little bit more sense for this scenario. So let's make this happen. We'll do col-3 for each one of these. I'm just gonna, nope, what am I doing? I'm going to copy this and paste it down here. Give it to March, April, May, all the way. Almost done with the year. And December. All right, let's see. This is the before. We give each one of these months a col-3. And we got 4 equal columns all the way across. One of the biggest misconceptions that I had when I was first learning about grids is that you could only fit 12 columns in a single row before you had to create a whole new row. And that's not true. If you add up all the columns inside this row, you get 36. However, what I said earlier still holds true. You can only space 12 columns in a single line before you start wrapping onto the next line. So if the number of columns in a row exceeds 12, it will automatically wrap and go on to the next line. It's also worth mentioning that we put all 12 months inside the same row to show you all that rows can allow you to cluster relevant content together. If we wanted to continue building on this page and create a section for horoscopes, I wouldn't necessarily go here and put everything and shove everything inside the same row, but perhaps now for different content, I would create and cluster them together in a separate row than this one. At this point, you have everything that you need to put your column sizing skills to the test and recreate the screenshots in the Grid Challenges folder. You're essentially going to play around with the number 12 to resize your columns to recreate these screenshots, and building the skill will help you create more complex page layouts in the future. In the next video, we'll explore some of the components on Bootstrap to create a travel blog page and take our knowledge of Bootstrap's grid system to the next level by learning how to make these columns more responsive to different screen sizes. At this point though, pause here and go ahead and have fun with the rest of these challenges, and once you're done, I'll see you in the next video.